Excellent, guys. Good to have you all back. Guys, very short break, but we're going to go from 12 to 1 here, and then we'll have a break of about 30 minutes, and then I'll do the second part of the history books. I must start by saying that I had a PowerPoint that I've been unable to access, unfortunately, so I have got a very shoddy, quick PowerPoint thrown up for some of this session. So I would encourage you, if you have a Bible, please just have it handy so you can open it up. There's not a lot of direct reading, but certainly a lot of references as well. So yeah, fantastic job from Mohan. I really loved some of the questions that Mohan was asking, and I really appreciate a lot of that wisdom coming from a wise man. So yeah, we're going to look, and this may seem strange. You're like, why are we now going backwards? We got to get Mohan in early this morning. So we've now coming in with what would have been my follow-up session, because I've already covered the law, Genesis to Deuteronomy. So now we're covering Joshua all the way through to Esther. So we're covering the history books, and there are many books to cover. So as I've said before, I will cover things in some detail, but maybe for you, you'd rather have some more detail on other things as well. So we'll cover this for 1 hour here, roughly. And then we'll get lunch, and then after that, we will have a session for half an hour. So it's slightly different than originally planned. This will be a longer session. One after lunch will be a shorter one with opportunities for questions. At this present time, I'm going to move the box around on my screen. I can't see anyone's faces. So if someone needs to stop me because something stops working, can I ask James, Thomas, or Mohan or Tomislav, any of the co-hosts, just to let me know that there's a problem. Otherwise I'll be going on for, yeah, that's great. Perfect, guys. Good job. All right, so we're going to cover the history books now. Funny, the only face I can see is my own now. How disconcerting that is. But anyway, so we're following on now. Now we're starting at the book of Joshua. So, book of Joshua. So Moses has died. We see that at the end of Deuteronomy. We know he's not going to fully get into the promised land, but he's been shown the promised land. So Israelites themselves, as we know, the newer generation, are ready to enter into the promised land. Turning my heating down here. So they're ready to enter into the promised land. So as I say, I've only got a few slides here, but the book of Joshua, the slides that I have is just to outline an overview of what it is that the book of Joshua covers. So you've broken it down into 4 segments. We've kind of got the chapters 1 to 5 is when Joshua leads Israel. 6 to 12 is when he has the battle with the Canaanites. And then 13 to 22 is Joshua divides up the land. And then after that, we've got Joshua's final words. I've now moved my screen so I can see faces. I can now see Mohan's face. So should there be a problem, Mohan can let me know. It's much better looking at faces than black screens, I have to say. It's very difficult to speak the black screens. I've got to speak the faces. It's the way we were made. Anyway, so this is the sections. This is how it's broken up. And what we're going to look at first then is Joshua leads Israel. The first 1 to chapters 5, Joshua, at this point then, he sends out the spies. Remember, we talked before about the first attempt to send out spies, and we've got 10 negative reports with 2 positive reports. Well, this time, it goes better. The spies go out, and then the faithful response takes over, and then they come back and say, Joshua and Caleb is like, we can do this. You know, we can achieve this. You know, with God, we can go into the land now, and we're not scared. They look big, they look mighty, they look like a challenge, but we've got on our side, we can do this. So in chapters 3 to 4 then, Joshua leads Israel into the promised land. And I love this story because it's in chapters 3 to 4 that in part of this journey, they have to cross the River Jordan. And as they do this, God says to them in chapter 4, and they have to bring the ark through as well, they were to gather up stones from the river. It says in chapter 4 and verse 1, the nation had finished crossing the Jordan. The Lord said to Joshua, choose 12 men from among the people, 1 from each tribe, and tell them to take up the 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan from right where the priests are standing, so that they carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. And then he goes on later on to say, what do these, verse 5, go before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes, to serve as a sign among you In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. Do you remember what we were saying yesterday? The people were to make intentional actions to make sure that they didn't forget what God had done. Why? Otherwise, you will forget. That's human nature. You're going to forget this, or you'll not forget it that it happened, but you'll start to forget exactly what it was that happened. So God was like, make a point. God instructed them to do this. Make sure you that's a physical effort to take up 12 stones on your shoulders and then also be ready to share with other people why you've done this. The key point here, if you read through these first few chapters, is that the battle that they have with the Canaanites is not their battle, but God's battle. In Joshua 3, verse 10, God tells them, as I say, if you have to have your Bibles with you guys, in this case, I actually have the scripture in this one. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. There's a lot of people. Jebusites were the people of Jerusalem. God will be the one that drives them out. I know you're about to go into a battle right now, but it's not really your battle. I'm driving the nations out because of their sin, because of how they were acting before me. Their sin had reached its full measure, which we'll hear about soon. And God was the one that would drive them out. So it's just to remind the people, this battle, it's not yours, but mine. I was sharing with I took my 9-year-old into evangelism on Thursday night. There was only a few of us. So I actually went with my 9-year-old. We walked around. We invited a few people. Have you ever walked around doing anything with a 9-year-old? Do you ever hear how many questions they have about everything and anything? You got to be prepared when you're with a 9-year-old. When you're with a child, you got to know your answers. So I was asking me loads and loads of questions about what we were doing. But I think ultimately what I was saying is God goes before us here. That this is not my idea, my plan. To be honest with you, I don't always want to reach out. I don't always want to talk to people. But God is the one that goes before us. This is his battle. This is his idea. We're just simply following on with what God has asked us to do. So this is the battles. The battles God wants to remind the people, it's my battle, not your battle. So in chapters 6 to 12, then, we have the battle with the Canaanites. Major battles, as we will remember, and we'll have heard about, the Battle of Jericho, or as the fall of Jericho. And the whole idea of Jericho, as you know, the people were to march around the wall 7 times, and then they'd make out a battle cry. And there was a band there as well with the trumpets. And to be honest with you, there is no military technician in the world that would ever have had this plan. This plan was never going to work. Why are we doing this? Why are we marching around these walls? But again, the idea was God's the one that will deliver you. Do it my way. I know I'm giving you strange rules here, strange strategies, but if you follow them, they will work. If you follow my word and don't lean on your own strategies, that's what will bring you success. So the people are being encouraged. So note this. The people are being encouraged to keep listening to the Lord's instructions. However, this doesn't last. People following the Lord's instructions, doing things his way, doesn't last. And we know in chapter 7 of Joshua, we get to Achan's sin. Achan's sin. He took some of the devoted things. He lied about it. And as a result, they were in the camp. And in verse 1 of chapter 7, we can see the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and they were defeated in battle because of Achan's sin, and it needed to be dealt with. I actually do cover this in my channel about how God acted in this situation and why it was that his family were no doubt involved in this, although it doesn't explicitly necessarily say this. But the whole point in all of this, because this became a big problem for the Israelites, they needed to deal with the sin among them because they were being viewed as a community going into battle on behalf of the Lord here. And the whole idea was, if you're going to inherit the land I've promised to give you, you must be obedient and follow my commands. You must follow what I'm asking you to do. You know, it's not your way again, but it's my way. And as you read on, they go into the battles. And the good thing is, they then deal with Achan's sin. They deal with his lies. And from verse 12 onwards, what we then have, and you'll probably see this in the Bible a lot, you come to these chapters when you're reading and you think, oh my, how am I supposed to read about this list of kings? This is not necessarily the most interesting read, like reading genealogies. And you can see it from chapter 12, 13. The land is then divided up. Allotment for different kings, different groups. I'm just going to hit the omit button when I see it in front of my screen. So you'll see that the land's divided up. And it summarizes all the victories. Chapter 12 onwards, it summarizes the victories. So I want to approach a question for a moment that may anticipate it being asked and cover it relatively quickly. Obviously, we could go into more detail. And it is the question of, that may or may not be in your mind. Let me just click on my screen again here. It may or may not be on your mind, but it's the idea of, why would God have the people go to war? Why does the people instruct it to go and deal with other peoples? What is this all about? And I'm sure you can imagine at the moment, this question of war is a very pertinent question. And we may not get a satisfactory answer to it, but I have dealt with this myself quite a lot on my channel. And I think there's two answers. And the second one I'm going to suggest here is something that I haven't necessarily said so much publicly in the past. But the first one was the idea of what God was doing potentially in dealing with the people as he commanded. So the first one, is the idea that God gave us the command on account of the people's sin and its influence. This is Deuteronomy 9:4, Deuteronomy 20:18. It was the sin of the nations that meant that God needed to act. God needed to do something. People complain if God doesn't act. And in this instance, God needed to act. We also know from Genesis 15 that God gives people time to repent. It says in Genesis 15 that the sin of the Amorites had not reached its full measure. He had been waiting over 400 years, and the full measure of the sin, which we'll see in a moment, was ultimately child sacrifice. And so much child sacrifice that even some of the Israelites were affected by this sin themselves. It seems incomprehensible to us today that you would put your child in the arms of a burning statue and they would beat drums around the statue to drown out the noise of the child. This is incomprehensible to us. And I would imagine incomprehensible to God. He says in the scriptures, I didn't permit you to do this. I didn't ask you to do this. It never entered my mind that you would give up your child in this way. It's pointless. But God needed to deal with this. Again, I pose the question, if God hadn't dealt with it, people would be like, what kind of God is this that allows this to continue? So we know also then that God ordered the destruction as the sins had reached its full measure. We also know that Israelites engaged in it. Solomon in 1 Kings 11 was said to have followed the god Molech and potentially sacrificed his son. So that for me, that's the first explanation for me anyway, as to why God needed to deal with the peoples. He needed this to happen. It wasn't because of the righteousness of the Israelites, but the sin of the nations that were there. There is an alternative viewpoint, and I must admit, I didn't really accept this one until later years, and it's coming from a book. I should have it on my shelf. I've got two of them on my shelf somewhere. Is God a Moral Monster? I can't see it right now that everyone's watching. It's God a Moral Monster by, I have it up there, but I think it's Dave Copan. So the point of his book, which I've came around to, is the idea that when it says destroy, it wasn't necessarily the command to kill. In Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 to 6, it talks about the command when you go into the land. I'll just read it very briefly here. Driving out the nations. So in Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 to 6, it says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land you're entering to possess and drives out before you all the nations, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you've defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. So that would sound like kill them all. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. So then it goes on to say, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons. For they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and he'll quickly destroy you. This is what you are to do to them. So specifically, this is what you're to do to them. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire, for you are people holy to the Lord. Now we'll cover a little bit more. The point in this book is, and I've came around to this potential idea, is that the destroy is not literal. He doesn't literally mean. Now, again, I know some of us may think, no, I'm not with you on this, Simon, and I wasn't for a while, and I'm still in two minds about it, but I think it certainly makes sense. In Joshua chapter 10, so bear with me on this one. I know if I heard this a few years ago, I just thought, no, you're just trying to excuse this. Joshua chapter 10, verses 36, and Judges. Joshua chapter 10. I say I had all these notes on my PowerPoint that I was unable to access, so apologies for that. 36, and Joshua and all Israel with him went up from Eglon to Hebron and attacked it. They took the city and put it to the sword, together with its king, its villages, and everything in it. They left no survivors, just as at Eglon they totally destroyed it and everyone in it. But if you read on later on, and we know this from other places as well, Joshua 15 verses 13 to 15, it talks about 14 from Hebron, Caleb drove out 3 Anakites, and it mentions them by name. And there's other instances like this as well, where it says that they totally destroyed all the people in the land. And then later on, they drove out some people in the land who had apparently previously been totally destroyed. I know a verse that we looked at previously where God had talked about this in Numbers 33. So I'll clarify what exactly I'm on about with all this in a moment. But Numbers 33, in verse 50, hopefully you do have Bibles with these, but if not, you can write these down. On the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, destroy all their carved images and their cast idols, and demolish all their high places, take possession of the land, and settle in it, for I have given you the land to possess. Distribute the land by lot according to your clans. To a larger group give a larger inheritance, to a smaller group give a smaller one. Whatever falls to them by lot will be theirs. Distribute it according to your ancestral tribes. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land, those you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will give you trouble in the land where you live. So the point here is that the Bible, and this is a possible option, all right? I'm not saying that we all accept this today, but this would fit with other ancient battle accounts. The terminology being used is things like the word destroy. In other words, complete annihilation. But the Bible was written from an observer perspective, from our perspective, so the people had wanted to make this point that we completely completed this task, that we destroyed them. We would use that maybe in almost joking terms in a sporting context. We destroyed them. And it was in keeping with other battle accounts to use the words destroy. But there were situations where it seemed like there were people left in the land. And then sometimes when God broke it down what exactly they were to do, they were to drive the inhabitants out of the land. So the idea, again, it's an interesting read. I would encourage us to do it. But I didn't like this when I first heard it. But a few times I've been reading these scriptures myself, and it seemed like the people, they were instructed to drive them out was more of the command. But again, I know that some of us will not like that right now at this point. But that's some theories on why did God allow or declare war? So that's a couple of potential options for us. But we'll skip on to the chapters 13 to 22, where we then see that Joshua divides up the land. And that's, again, as I say, that's chapters 13 to 22. I'm just going to flick back there myself again. But again, if you see all the chapter headings of 13 to 22, it's dividing up the land for Judah, for Ephraim and Manasseh, and from all the different tribes that they were being allotted. And just a point to make on that, lists were important to the Israelites. Why? Well, that meant that God is faithful. Because in previous promises and what we heard about yesterday was that God said, here's what will happen when you get to the land. Here's what I want you to give to this tribe and to this tribe and to this tribe. So now that they've actually got that, they have something to say, God is faithful. Do we ever write down answered prayers? I remember every year I've said this, I get a jar, I lift up the jar. When the prayer is answered, I write it in a bit of paper and I write it in. Or you could write in a prayer requests, put them in a jar and lift them out. And oh my goodness, look at the amount of prayers that God has answered. So like I was saying yesterday, be intentional about remembering. The Israelites were intentional about remembering what God had actually done. Again, writing down the list of how God had brought about success for them. So I really like this idea. But going on to chapters 23 to 24, the whole point here is, this is the end. Joshua's final words. He had led them in battle. They'd been successful. They dealt with the sin among them. They've recognized that it was God's battle, not their battle. But Joshua realized that, you know what? He didn't know Judges was about to come, but we know Judges is about to come. And it's not good. It's really not good. There's bad things about to come. And let's be honest, Joshua probably realized when he sees the nature of people, and we realize when we see the nature of people, there's going to be tough times ahead. I don't know if these guys are going to stay faithful. So I got to give them some parting words to make sure they understand what they need to do. So here's just his parting words. In verses, again, Joshua 23, 1-8, as I say, I had these on a PowerPoint and I was unable to access it as I come on this morning. But hopefully we can follow along. And it says, after a long time, if not, just please listen. After a long time had passed and the Lord had given Israel rest, chapter 23, from all their enemies around them, Joshua, by then a very old man, summoned all Israel, their elders, leaders, judges, and officials, and said to them, I am very old. That might get their attention. I'm very old. You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. I'll be in bold there. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. Remember that point? Remember how I have allotted as an inheritance for your tribes all the land of the nations that remain, the nations I conquered between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea in the west. The Lord your God himself will push them out for your sake. He will drive them out before you, and you will take possession of their land, as the Lord your God promised you. Be very strong. Be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses without turning aside to the right or to the left. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them, but you're to hold fast to the Lord your God as you have until now. The Lord has driven out before you great and powerful nations to this day. No one can withstand you. We could read on, and as I read some of those, it does go back to what I was sharing with you and why I've came around to the idea that they were to drive out the nations. And that's instructions by God. He was the one that would help them to drive them out. But again, I'll not go back to that point again. But the idea is that Joshua is encouraging the people. Remember, just like what we said this morning, God's the one that did this. He's the one that brought you here. Don't forget him. It's so important that you remember. And you should be able to recount these stories of God's faithfulness to each other, but also to your children. They won't have experienced this. And like I say, things are about to go very badly wrong. So this is Joshua's final words. We have the people getting into the promised land. Let's see how things go in the promised land. So we go on to Judges. I think I have, we'll go on to that scripture in a minute. We'll go on to Judges. Now, we're on the book of Judges. Judges is the one I'll spend a little bit more time on. But Judges, as we maybe know already, simply means leader. The Hebrew word, shaphat, means heroic leader. Probably a way that we would all like to be considered, I would imagine. You were a great way to be described. You were a heroic leader. The meaning was the idea that they were to put right or to rule. This judge that God raised up was to put things right or to rule. This time of Judges, the elders had outlived Joshua until David came and we had Saul came and we had the monarchy. So this is the time between Joshua dying and the monarchy in Israel. So Saul and David and then Solomon. That's the time period that Judges is dealing with. And in verse 2, verse 16, God raised up judges who saved the peoples from the nations around them. And this is a constant theme that we'll see again and again. Jewish tradition tells us, Betha Buthra, 14b to 15a, states that the likely author was Samuel, although some have said the authorship is likely uncertain. The date of the book is unknown, but undoubtedly during the time of the monarchy. Here's the scripture that most of us will know, that is said so often, that really is the key verse of Judges. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Explaining the idea that they really need to have someone that they look up to. In those days, Israel had no king. So this phrase itself would suggest that the writing was after the establishment of the monarchy, that's the time that this book was actually written. There's also the observation that the Jebusites still controlled Jerusalem, chapter 1 to 21. And also at the time before David captured the city. You can read about that in 2 Samuel 5, 6-10. We know about him going up the water shaft. David captured the city of Jerusalem in around 1000 BC as well. So, and the conditions that are alluded to in Judges, so again, I'm just referring to the date here, which suggests the time after the Davidic dynasty. So just after 1000 BC, you'll be looking at as a time of writing. So it's good to say this. This might sound a bit dry sometimes, but it's good to have some sort of idea as to when were these books written? When was this penned? When was this written down? So Judges, a bit of the theme and theology of Judges then, is dealing with the time that Israel is in the promised land. So we've talked about the promised land a lot, about waiting on the promised land, about to go into the promised land. Well, now they're in the promised land. As I say, it's from the time of the death of Joshua to the rise of the monarchy. But what we're dealing with in Judges, we're going to come on to it now, is frequent apostasy and an urgent appeal to God. It's a repetition. Apostasy, oh God, please help us. Apostasy, oh God, please help us in times of crisis. And what God did, and hence the title of the book, is God raised up leaders, judges, to throw off the foreign oppressors. Israel is now in the promised land. The people had displaced the Canaanites and cleansed the land of paganism, of all the things that I had mentioned earlier, like the god Molech and sacrificing your children and all these detestable practices they're called. The whole theme of this book, the best way to summarize Judges for me, is the idea of God's lordship, the lordship of God in Israel. And the kingship is uniquely established. So God is uniquely established as the king now that they've got into the land. They've got to where they're supposed to be going to, and now God's uniquely established as the king. So what we had previously, and we mentioned it yesterday, is the covenant at Sinai, Exodus 19-24. We then have a repeating of that. Remember we shared yesterday about Deuteronomy, that Moses in the plains of Moab, Deuteronomy 29, and then Joshua at Shechem in Joshua 24. We have a repeating of God is your king, the Lord is one. This idea that God, the kingship of God is uniquely established and repeated. And that's the issue that people face when they went into the promised land. So the key issue then about Judges that we'll come to now, which I think is very pertinent for us, although it may not seem that way to begin with. Whenever the people got into the promised land, you could say today as Christians, we're sitting in it may not feel like a promised land. We know we're awaiting heaven. But if you're on the other side of a life where you lived in sin and now you're a disciple, then in some respects you're on that other side, if you like. The key issue is that people turn to the other gods of Canaan as a source of their blessing. This was their major issue. And they did this because of family, flocks, and fields. They wanted these things to be blessed. They needed these things to be blessed, so they turned to the other gods of Canaan. And that's something we're going to mention again in a moment. They abandoned God's law of daily living. They rejected God again and again and his kingship. Again, as I say, again and again. They needed to be reminded of the theocracy. Theocracy is this idea that God alone is their king. You can see that, I think, in Judges 8, verse 23. It says, but Gideon told them, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. This idea was repeated throughout the time in Judges. It's God is your king. It's the theocracy. And you need to be reminded that God is your king. But as we say, in those days, Israel had no king. And what happens when they have no king? Well, everyone does as they saw fit. So the people disobeyed God. And what was the sign that they disobeyed God? They integrated with the nations around them. And as a result, and we'll probably recognize this terminology, God gave them over. We know that from the book of Romans. If God has established his role as the king of the people, and they reject him as their king, and do as they see fit, integrating with the peoples around them, James talks about being polluted by the world. In some respects, God gives them over. And this is what happens to the people. So here's the question then, as I'm getting into some murky stuff. Where did it all go wrong for the people? If you read the book of Judges, you'll see how badly wrong it goes when the people are in the promised land. They'd escaped slavery in Egypt. We asked the question, where did it all go wrong? And why did it all go wrong? Well, where it all went wrong, as I said already, is they turned to the other gods around them. They were warned about this. We can see, we read it earlier on in Numbers chapter 33, sorry. So Numbers 33, just a quick little look at that again. Numbers 33 in verse 50. It certainly is handy when I have the scriptures up, because then I don't have to flick around either here. You just have to wait on me. So Numbers 33, verse 50, in the plains of Moab by the Jordan, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Why? Or what do you have to do? Destroy all their carved images and their cast idols, and demolish all their high places. Take possession of the land and settle in it, for I've given you the land. Distribute the land by lot. So the first action they were to take was to drive out the nations. Why? Don't become like them. Don't start doing what they do. Don't start acting the way they act. I'm dealing with the sin of the nations. Don't you go in and then repeat the sin of the nations and allow yourself to be polluted by them. So if you're not going to be polluted by them, then you're going to have to deal with them early on. But they didn't do what God had asked them to do. They didn't follow his instructions. So as they go into the promised land, and we're going to come back to this, politically, Canaan city-states were displaced by Israel. However, Canaanite culture continued as a powerful influence on the Israelites' belief and behavior. So they drove out the peoples to some extent. They dealt with the fact that they ruled the land. However, Canaanite culture remained, and it continued to have a powerful influence. And here's a really incredible phrase that, again, I will come back to in the next few minutes. The editor of Judges regarded the religion of Canaan as a more formidable force than its armies. And when Israel was tempted to adopt its values, disaster was the inevitable outcome. So would you believe, as the people went into the land, they thought the biggest problem we have is dealing with the peoples and their armies? When in actual fact, if we read through the book of Judges, what you'll actually see is, no, the religion of Canaan is your biggest problem. The religion of the people around you, you adopting its practices, is actually the biggest issue you have, not the armies themselves. So in Judges chapter 2, and as I keep saying, we will reflect on this a bit more, but Judges chapter 2 then, in verse 11, let's see, just going to fix my screen a little bit. Let's see. So Judges 2, yep, chapter, verses 11, it says, then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. So there they are, the Baals, the land of Canaan. They forsook the Lord and God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. There we go. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of the raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around them, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. So I don't know about you, but you didn't think this was going to happen. I didn't think that the peoples would go into the promised land and then adopt the culture and the gods of the people who were living there and actually start to worship them. This is exactly what God had warned them about. But this statement in Judges 2 here summarizes, really, all historical narratives in the Bible. From Elijah to Jeremiah, that James will cover later on, they all said the same thing. The people of Israel are going to ruin. Why? Because of their love for foreign gods. That's what's wrong. That's why they have this endless cycle of disobedience. Then they cry out to God in their distress because they're following other gods. Last night we talked in Deuteronomy about this is what happens when you follow God, and this is what happens when you don't. When you don't follow God and what happens? You worship something else, and then you have, unfortunately, suffer the consequences of that. And that's what was happening. So as we mentioned there already, just very briefly, who were these other gods at the time in the Promised Land? Well, we've seen there the Baals and the Ashtoreths. If we were to go today, and I did originally have a picture of this, to Ras Shmarna, off the coast of modern Syria, opposite Cyprus, at the site of the ancient Ugarit, and it was a city that flourished in the 14th, 15th centuries. The religion at the time of Israel is very similar to this. It's a collection of clay tablets that have been found in the annex to the temple in Ugarit. And all about it, what it depicts and describes is the story of Baal and all the other Canaanite deities from the Old Testament, and all these objects and tablets, much like the information about how they were being worshipped. So this would have been very similar to the time of Israel in the time of the Promised Land, and how they would have followed these other gods. Again, we can read about that from these tablets. But the key characters in the Ugarite pantheon was El was chief of the gods. So El was chief of the gods. Asherah was his female companion. So Asherah was a female companion. But they actually took a back seat, even though to Baal, who was the weather god, he was known as their son, but they took a back seat to him. Because he was the weather god, and his lover Anat, who was a goddess of love and war. The story goes, just about these gods for a moment, but the story goes that Baal was attacked by Mot. So M-O-T, it makes me think of my car for some reason, but Mot, just spelling it for us there. He was the god of death. He was attacked by him and killed, destroyed, and then scattered the body to the four corners. And then the story goes, and this is playing into the mindset of those who followed these gods, which is why I'm telling us today. His body was scattered to the four corners, and his partner, Anat, took revenge. So there's a poem written that we can find it in tablets today, how Anat, Baal's lover, if you like, took revenge for him being killed. And I'll tell you why I'm telling you this now in a second. But the main ideological purpose of all of this was to maintain agricultural status quo, because these gods were the goddesses of love and war and the weather. And what happened in Israel at this time, or in the Promised Land, was the rains would come between October and May. And if they ever stopped, so if you're in the land and the rain stopped, which often happened in that part of the world, it seemed like Baal was dead, because Baal is the god of the weather. So if the weather's not favorable to you, very superstitious culture, then it means there's a problem with Baal. Baal must be dead. So here's what happened, and it's very difficult for us to conceive of this, is that the people would act out the story of Baal and Anat, his lover, even sexually at times, to make sure all the crops would blossom, to make sure that things would go right in regards to the weather. So they would sometimes reenact this to make sure that Baal was happy, to make sure that Baal was alive. Now, I'm sure in our minds, we're thinking, what on earth? That doesn't make sense to our culture today. But that was the culture that they were in. And we know there are many cultures today that are very superstitious like that. But here's the point for the Israelites now in the Promised Land, dealing with all these other gods who were supposedly the gods of the weather and the agriculture. These were the gods that would help you have a flourishing, bounty of fields and crops. God was, to the Israelite, the mindset of the Israelite would be that God was a God of the desert. He brought us from Egypt through the desert to the Promised Land. But that doesn't mean he's going to be a God of the weather, of our fertility of our women and fields and flocks. This God that got us to this point was a good God. He's a powerful God. I mean, clearly he can act on our behalf. But that doesn't mean now that we're in this new land that he can help us look after our fields and our flocks and the fertility of our families. And because of this, there's evidence that many Israelites worshiped Yahweh. But here's what they did. They played it safe by using Canaanite shrines and rituals as well. They thought, well, surely let's just play it safe. We'll still worship God. He brought us here. He's a powerful God. But let's just play it safe for worshiping these other gods, because these people in the next field from me are worshiping Baal, and they seem to be having crops. Their crops are growing and mine aren't, or mine might not be. So let me just play it safe by worshiping Baal as well, worshiping Asherah as well. And we can see this in the way many leading Israelite families lived. They otherwise praised faithful worship of Yahweh, but they also gave their children names that would invoke the protection of traditional deities of Canaan. And we can see this in the life of Saul. King Saul, the first king of Israel, he had a son called Jonathan, which means gift of Yahweh. But then he also has a son called Ishbaal, means the man of Baal. And he was the first king of Israel. So we can see that many Israelites, including some of the leaders, had this mentality of, well, I need to worship God, but I also want to play it safe for these other gods because, hey, look, we need to have food, we need to have a life, we need to have children, so we're just going to play it safe. Beel and Anat were attached to many Israelite towns and villages. Beel and Anat. So these other gods, these other false gods that God had warned them about, are attached to the names of villages and towns in Israel. These synchronistic practices were the greatest threat to Israel, but I'm saying this today because I think they can be the greatest threat to us as well. It's this idea, when God repeated in the Shema, he said, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You're not to worship any other God apart from me. You're to worship me with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. God, sometimes people have an issue with the idea that God asks for undivided devotion and worship to him only. And then when you see the Israelites entering the promised land, you can see, well, okay, now I can see why God asked for sole devotional worship to him only. Because what happens is you adopt the practices of the people around you and start to worship their gods as well, maybe in some instances, just to play it safe. Do you remember Saul's reaction whenever he, in 1 Samuel 15, when he was asked about what he was doing, and he had left some of the sheep, and God said, did you not obey the voice of the Lord? And he's like, I did obey the voice of the Lord. I destroyed everything apart from these sheep, but here, I've only kept these sheep to sacrifice them to you. So he was trying to justify his worship of God by doing things his own way. And as I say, we know that this man had named his son after the Baal as well. So the whole idea is that they combine the worship of Yahweh with other synchronistic practices, other gods as well. Why do I say this today? Well, can we not do the same? It's so easy to get up, read our Bibles and pray, go to church and worship God. But what God's concerned about is there any other gods in our life? Now, I say this today because it's not Baal or Ashtoreth, is it? It's not statues. We're not worshiping statues. We're not praying to anything else. But what defines worship? Well, for me, it's what's on my mind. Like, what do I think about most of all? What goes through my mind most? What do I think about? And that, obviously, I appreciate Descartes' comments. I think, therefore I am. Like, whatever I think about, I will do. That's who I am. And for me personally, I get challenged by this because in the past, maybe for me, training used to be a god of mine. I think these days, sometimes it's, I've even had moments over the last year or two where I've thought, I need to get a bit more financially stable. And I've had periods even recently where I've found myself in a day spending way too many hours thinking about money and how I would manage it in my life. And my justification for saying that's not a big deal is, well, it's because we lack. That's why I'm thinking about it, God. I'm thinking about it so much because I lack in this area. So question for us today is there any other gods in our mind? Is there anything else that dominates our thoughts? Maybe it's security. Maybe it's peace. Maybe it's, I just want to, because many of us came into the church and I must admit, some of us are having to deal with the fact that it's challenging today at times. Things aren't as unified as we want them to be. People aren't as all together as much as they want them to be. When I joined the church, I thought it'd be a harmonious group gathered together in the church and we could travel around the UK and everything would be wonderful. It's not quite like that right now. And sometimes that can be disheartening and discouraging and we can find yourself pulling back. I have to be honest, I did a few lessons recently where I've pointed out that I feel like sometimes people are drawn back in devotion to being disciples, devotion to sharing their faith, and however that looks, people are drawing back. So I say this because it's so easy for us, and so many Israelites had done this, to start worshiping other gods. I think this is the greatest threat. And why is it the greatest threat? Well, I think it's the greatest threat because we still worship God in our minds. We can still say, I still go to church. I still read the Bible. I still pray. But the risk is there something else that's also fighting for attention from God? So think about that today. I'm sharing this today because I personally was so impacted when I read this and I realized that their downfall was something that we may face ourselves, something that I might face myself today. So it really is something just to think about. So I think we're doing well enough for time. I'm going to finish up there. Give us 10 more minutes just to give any thoughts on that, any questions. Again, that's the history books, Joshua and Judges, and then we're going to go back after lunch and cover Ruth, Let's see, I've got these Ruth Samuel King's Chronicles, and we're going to come back and do that afterwards. But I'm going to stop sharing and just give us any time to share any thoughts or questions that we may have.